Imagine a nightmare scenario for any fighting force. You've poured every ounce of ingenuity and resource into building the perfect defense. You've learned from devastating losses, adapted your tactics, and equipped your men with the best available technology. You feel, finally, that you have a solution. You are confident. Then, out of nowhere, an enemy strikes from a distance you never conceived possible. They hit you hard, with a weapon you didn't even know existed, and your vaunted defenses are utterly useless. Your most advanced guns can't reach. Your best-trained crews are left firing into empty air, watching in horror as their comrades are torn apart by an invisible, untouchable threat. This isn't a scene from science fiction. This was the terrifying reality for the German Kriegsmarine in the dying days of the Battle of the Atlantic, facing a weapon so audacious, so unconventional, that it shattered their defensive doctrines and contributed significantly to the ultimate defeat of their U-boat fleet. This is the story of the Havilland Mosquito Tsetse, a wooden wonder transformed into a flying artillery piece, armed with a 57mm anti-tank gun and the devastating impact it had on the war at sea. To truly grasp the revolutionary nature of the Mosquito Tsetse, we first need to rewind to the brutal crucible of the Battle of the Atlantic, specifically the period leading up to 1944. For years, this vast, unforgiving ocean had been the stage for a relentless, existential struggle. Britain, a nation utterly dependent on sea lanes for survival, was being slowly strangled by Admiral Dönitz's U-boat wolfpacks. Early in the war, the U-boats were terrifyingly effective. Lone merchant ships, or even early convoys, were easy prey for Dönitz's cunning tactics and his highly trained crews. However, by 1943, the tide was beginning to turn, dramatically and decisively, in favor of the Allies. This shift wasn't a single silver bullet, but rather a convergence of technological breakthroughs and tactical innovations. Allied centimetric radar, impervious to German detection, could suddenly spot U-boats from miles away, day or night. Long-range patrol aircraft, now equipped with powerful searchlights like the Lee Light, could hunt submarines even under the cloak of darkness. Improved intelligence, particularly from the deciphering of Enigma codes by the ultra-secret, provided Allied commanders with uncanny foresight into U-boat movements. And perhaps most critically, the Allied escort groups had become far more effective, with better training, improved sonar, and more deadly depth charges. The result was catastrophic for the Kriegsmarine. In the spring of 1943, a period infamously known as Black May, Dönitz's U-boat fleet suffered truly unsustainable losses. More than 40 U-boats were sunk in that single month, a staggering rate that decimated crews, shattered morale, and fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the war at sea. The traditional U-boat tactic of surfacing at night to recharge batteries or attack, relying on crash diving when spotted, was no longer a viable option. Allied aircraft, once a nuisance, had become the U-boat's deadliest predator. Faced with this existential threat, Admiral Dönitz, a man of profound strategic insight and unwavering determination, refused to concede defeat. He recognized that the old ways were no longer working. If U-boats couldn't avoid the aircraft, then they would have to fight them. This radical shift in doctrine led to the U-flak experiment. The idea was simple, yet audacious. Convert a number of existing Type 7 U-boats into heavily armed anti-aircraft platforms. Torpedo tubes were either removed or their load dramatically reduced to make room for an astonishing array of anti-aircraft weaponry. U-441, for instance, became the prototype U-flak-1, bristling with formidable armament. 2 quadruple 20mm Flak-Vierling 38 cannons and a single, more powerful 37mm gun. The vision was to create a floating anti-aircraft fortress, a vessel that, rather than meekly diving, would remain on the surface and unleash a devastating barrage of fire against any attacking aircraft. The goal was to force Allied planes to approach within 500 meters to drop their depth charges or fire rockets, a distance at which even heavily armored aircraft would be vulnerable to the concentrated fire of multiple automatic weapons. The U-flak boats were designed to act as mobile anti-aircraft escorts for other U-boats, or to defend themselves when caught on the surface. But Dönitz also extended this defensive philosophy to surface escorts. He ordered that convoys of U-boats be flanked by heavily armed escort vessels, like M-class minesweepers and especially the Speerbreckers, converted merchant ships with concrete-reinforced hulls and a veritable forest of 20mm and 37mm guns. The intent was to create overlapping fields of anti-aircraft fire, a wall of steel that would make any approach by Allied aircraft suicidal. This new defensive doctrine, born from the bitter lessons of 1943, imbued German convoy commanders with a renewed sense of confidence. They believed they had finally found a way to negate the Allied air superiority, to turn the hunters into the hunted. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, particularly within Britain's coastal command, the U-flak boats and their heavily escorted convoys presented a new, perplexing challenge. Standard low-level attacks, once effective, had become suicide missions. Pilots recounted harrowing experiences of flying through a veritable storm of tracer fire, their aircraft shredded by the sheer volume of German anti-aircraft guns. Conventional depth charge attacks required approaching within point-blank range, typically 500 meters or less, precisely the sweet spot the Germans had designed their defenses to exploit. Even the newly introduced rockets required a relatively close approach. The British Air Ministry recognized the problem immediately. They needed a weapon that could engage targets, particularly hardened ones like U-boats and reinforced escort vessels, from beyond the effective range of German anti-aircraft defenses. They needed a standoff weapon, something that would allow their aircraft to strike decisively without exposing themselves to the deadly curtain of fire. This was a monumental design challenge. Conventional bombs were too inaccurate from altitude against moving targets. Rockets, while powerful, also lacked the precision needed for a consistent hit rate at longer ranges against specific points on a ship, especially U-boats with their relatively small, exposed profiles. The solution came from an unlikely, almost absurd source. Imagine a company that has spent decades perfecting the intricate mechanics of cigarette manufacturing. Automatic feeding mechanisms, precise cutting blades, efficient packaging lines. Now, imagine asking them to design an auto-loading system for a heavy anti-tank gun. This is precisely what happened with the Mullins Company of Peterborough, an engineering firm known for its sophisticated industrial machinery, not for armaments. The British Army's standard anti-tank weapon was the QF 6-pounder, a highly effective gun in its ground role, capable of knocking out most German tanks of the era. However, it was a manually loaded weapon, meaning a crew member had to physically load each heavy shell after it was fired. This was too slow for an aircraft application, where sustained fire was crucial. Enter Desmond Mullins and his team of engineers. They realized that the sophisticated automatic feeding mechanisms developed for their cigarette production lines, mechanisms designed to reliably handle delicate paper and tobacco at high speeds, could be adapted to the much more robust task of loading heavy artillery shells. It was a stroke of industrial genius, a testament to the versatility of engineering principles. They transformed a manually loaded gun into a semi-automatic cannon, theoretically capable of firing 55 rounds per minute, though the aircraft installation would be limited to 25 rounds due to weight and space restrictions. This adaptation was far from trivial. The feeding mechanism, initially based on a 5-tray system similar to their cigarette packaging equipment, had to be completely re-engineered. It needed to be reinforced with heavy-gauge steel, powered by powerful hydraulic rams, and robust enough to withstand the immense G-forces and vibrations encountered during violent combat maneuvers. Workers who had previously spent their days crafting precision components for handling delicate consumer goods were now meticulously machining parts for a weapon designed to tear apart steel warships. It was an extraordinary pivot, showcasing the incredible adaptability of British industry during wartime. With the Molin's autoloader perfected, the next challenge was finding a suitable aircraft to carry this monstrous weapon. The British needed something fast, robust, and capable of operating at various altitudes. The de Havilland Mosquito, affectionately known as the Wooden Wonder, was the perfect candidate. Conceived initially as an unarmed fast bomber that would rely purely on speed and altitude for survival, the Mosquito was an unconventional masterpiece. Built primarily of wood, a laminated plywood and balsa sandwich, at a time when other nations were transitioning to all-metal construction, it was dismissed by some as an anachronism. Yet, this unconventional approach yielded one of the most versatile and high-performance aircraft of the entire war. Its smooth plywood skin created less drag than riveted aluminum, and its twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines gave it a blistering top speed of over 400 mph. It excelled as a bomber, a fighter, a reconnaissance platform, and even a night fighter. De Havilland engineers at Hatfield faced significant hurdles in mounting the 57mm Molin's gun. The weapon itself weighed a staggering 1,580 pounds fully loaded, and its barrel projected prominently from the aircraft's nose. To accommodate it, the Mosquito FB Mark VI variant had to undergo substantial modification. The 420mm Hispano cannons, standard armament for the fighter-bomber version, had to be completely removed. Only the two 303 Browning machine guns were retained, primarily for aiming purposes, to walk tracers onto the target before unleashing the heavier punch. The sheer recoil generated by firing a 57mm cannon from an aircraft was immense. Initial firing trials in June 1943 with test pilot Pat Fillingham reported that the aircraft bucked violently. Rivets sheared in the forward fuselage, and the airframe groaned under the stress. This necessitated extensive structural reinforcement, including new struts, and, crucially, a massive hydraulic buffer beneath the gun. This buffer, a marvel of engineering, absorbed the lion's share of the gun's kick, preventing the aircraft from tearing itself apart. The hydraulic buffer created a distinctive bulge on the aircraft's belly, a telltale sign of the beast within. Further modifications included adding 900 pounds of armor plating around the engines and cockpit floor, a vital protection against return fire from the now heavily armed U-boats that were the primary targets. Despite these challenges, the trade-off seemed more than worthwhile. Tests showed the 57mm shell could penetrate a submarine's pressure hull, even through 2 feet of water, at a range of 1,400 meters. This was a critical revelation. It was far beyond the distance where German gunners could effectively engage a fast-moving aircraft. The Tsetse, named after the African fly, perhaps for its piercing sting, had arrived. While the British were secretly developing this formidable weapon, German intelligence was receiving fragmentary and often dismissed reports. Abwehr agents in neutral Portugal picked up rumors from Allied air crews who had made emergency landings, describing a flying 6-pounder that could destroy submarines with single shots. But at Naval High Command in Berlin, these reports were largely dismissed as propaganda. Staff officers argued that the recoil from such a heavy weapon would simply tear any wooden aircraft apart, unaware of the ingenious hydraulic buffer system and structural reinforcements de Havilland engineers had developed. This dismissal created a dangerous blind spot. The Germans were aware that Allied aircraft were maintaining distance from their convoys, conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance but not closing for attack. Lieutenant zur See Gunther Heinrich on U-960 had observed this strange behavior on a previous patrol. Corvette Captain Hans Rudolf Rosing, commanding the 2nd U-boat flotilla, noted in his war diary his growing concern about British aircraft seeming to possess an uncanny ability to locate U-boats, even with heavy escort. He was unaware, of course, that ultra-intercepts were feeding Coastal Command precise routing information. The Germans knew something was different, but they couldn't grasp the nature of the threat. Their experience-based assumptions about aircraft armament and vulnerabilities led them to underestimate the very real danger brewing in British hangars. To truly understand the impact of the Tsetse, we need a brief, albeit grim, lesson in the mathematics of anti-aircraft gunnery. German anti-aircraft doctrine, particularly for naval flak, had been shaped by years of combat in the Mediterranean and against low-flying aircraft. Commanders like Hauptmann Friedrich Christensen, commanding a flak battery in occupied France, trained his gunners to engage low-flying aircraft at ranges under 1,000 meters. This was the sweet spot where the highly effective 20mm Flak 38, with its rapid rate of fire, could reliably hit a target moving at 300 mm. But the moment the target remained at 1,500 meters or more, the mathematics changed dramatically. To hit a fast-moving aircraft at a distance, gunners had to lead their target, aiming not at where the plane was, but where it would be by the time the shell arrived. This required complex calculations involving target speed, direction, altitude, shell velocity, and windage. At extended ranges, the lead angles became so extreme that even minor errors in estimation resulted in complete misses. The 20mm Flak 38, while lethal at close range, became largely ineffective beyond 2,000 meters, with self-destructing shells limiting its maximum effective range. The 37mm guns, introduced to provide more reach, could theoretically engage up to 4,800 meters, but even these struggled with the deflection shooting required against fast-moving aircraft approaching at oblique angles. The Italian Regia Marina had learned similar harsh lessons during their convoy battles off Sicily, where their 20mm Breda guns, despite creating an impressive curtain of fire, rarely scored hits on British Beaufort torpedo bombers that released their weapons from beyond 1,000 meters. They too requested German 37mm guns, but found them still inadequate against determined, distant attacks. The 57mm Mollins gun, firing accurately at 1,800 yards, approximately 1,640 meters, was designed to operate precisely within this killing zone, a range where it could hit targets, but where German AA guns were severely hampered or completely ineffective. This created a profound, unanswerable tactical dilemma for the German defenders. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine aerial anti-shipping warfare. March 27, 1944. 0600 hours. The Bay of Biscay. Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Steinberg stood on the bridge of U-960, his Type VIC submarine moving through the pre-dawn darkness towards La Palisse. He was part of a meticulously arranged convoy, the U-boat flanked by two concrete-reinforced Speerbrecher vessels, themselves screened by 4 M-class minesweepers. Their multiple 20mm and 37mm flak guns bristled in the morning twilight, ready to unleash a wall of steel against any Allied aircraft foolish enough to attack. They were confident, perhaps even complacent, protected by Admiral Dönitz's new defensive doctrine, completely unaware that 6 British Mosquitoes, including 2 of the specially modified Tsetse variants, were already approaching from an altitude of 5,000 feet. Squadron leader Tony Phillips, a veteran of 248 Squadron who had been flying Mosquitoes over the Bay of Biscay since December 1943, led the formation in Mosquito NT-225. His navigator, Flight Officer Thompson, meticulously checked their position front against the estimated track of U-960. Information provided by intelligence sources, precise routing data gleaned from ultra-intercepts. The morning conditions were perfect for the attackers. Cloud cover at 3,000 feet offered concealment, while gaps in the overcast allowed them to spot the German convoy. Phillips positioned his formation to attack from the east, keeping the rising sun behind them, silhouetting the German ships while blinding their gunners. As Phillips began his descent, throttling back to maintain a steady approach speed, the German lookouts spotted the approaching aircraft. The convoy's defenses immediately erupted. A frantic, desperate barrage of fire clawed its way into the sky. Streams of 20mm tracers, like solid ropes of fire, reached out, self-destructing at 2,000 meters in puffs of black smoke. The larger 37mm rounds burned out their tracers at 3,000 meters, their invisible projectiles continuing further, a theoretical threat. Every gun that could bear opened fire, a magnificent, terrifying display of defensive power. Steinberg, on U-960's bridge, watched the tracers. He had seen this before. He knew the drill. The planes would have to close. They would enter the envelope of fire. Then they would be driven off or shot down. That was the doctrine. But these planes, they weren't closing. They maintained their distance. Then the impossible happened. The first 57mm shell from Phillips's Tsetse struck the leading sparebreaker vessel just above the waterline. The armor-piercing projectile didn't just explode against the hull. It punched clean through the converted merchant ship's plating. Inside, it detonated an ammunition storage compartment, sending a violent column of smoke and flame rocketing through ventilation shafts. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship's interior. German gun crews, trained to the limits of human endurance, maintained their fire even as damage control parties rushed to contain the spreading inferno, their discipline overriding the natural instinct to seek cover. Steinberg watched in utter disbelief. He had never heard that sound before during an air attack. The distinctive crack of a heavy-caliber shell penetrating steel. Previous attacks had been characterized by the whoosh of bombs or the thud of depth charges. This was different. This was precise surgical destruction from a distance. The attacking aircraft continued its run, seemingly untouched, firing measured shots with devastating accuracy. Each impact underscored the chilling reality. This new weapon had fundamentally changed the entire dynamic of the engagement. The attacker could remain outside the envelope where German gunners had trained to engage, effectively rendering their defenses obsolete. The second Tsetse, piloted by Flight Officer Turner in MM-425, focused its attention on U-960 itself. Turner lined up his sight on the submarine's conning tower, a concentrated cluster of anti-aircraft weapons and the nerve center of the boat. His first shell struck the bridge structure, sending lethal fragments scything through the gun crews. Steinberg felt the impact through his feet, a sickening tremor as the 57mm projectile tore through the submarine's outer casing, rupturing fuel bunkers and sending a telltale stream of diesel oil trailing in the boat's wake. The escort vessels, responding frantically, attempted to generate a smoke screen to obscure the submarine. But the Mosquito's altitude advantage allowed them to see through gaps in the artificial fog. Their pilots, adjusting aim points based on the last observed positions of their targets, continued to find their marks with disturbing regularity. Each impact degraded the convoy's defensive capability. Gun positions were knocked out, ammunition supplies detonated, and essential systems failed. Squadron leader Phillips made a second attack run, this time targeting one of the minesweepers that had moved to shield U-960. His remaining shells struck the vessel's bridge and engine room, causing it to lose speed, fall out of formation, and spew thick smoke from its ventilation grates as fires raged through its interior. Crews abandoned their gun positions to fight the flames, creating gaping holes in the defensive screen. These gaps were immediately exploited by the conventional Mosquito fighter bombers, which now closed in to deliver their rockets and cannon fire against the crippled, defenseless vessels. The psychological impact on the German crews was profound. Gunners, who had trained for months, even years, to repel air attacks, realized their weapons could not effectively engage the attacking aircraft. They were firing at ghosts, at targets that simply weren't entering their lethal range. This led to a pervasive sense of helplessness, a feeling that undermined morale far more effectively than conventional bombing attacks, where at least the defenders felt they were fighting back. This new reality forced a fundamental reconsideration of convoy defense tactics that had seemed adequate just months before. The confidence, so carefully rebuilt by Dönitz, was shattered in a matter of minutes. In the aftermath of the attack, U-960 limped into La Palisse, 3 escort vessels damaged, and hundreds of casualties sustained. Steinberg's after-action report starkly emphasized the impossibility of defending against aircraft that could engage from beyond effective flak range. He recommended that future convoys require fighter escort throughout their passage, rather than relying solely on anti-aircraft guns, a suggestion that revealed how completely the Mosquito Tsetse had disrupted German defensive doctrine. Initially, the Technical Intelligence Section at Marine Headquarters refused to believe the reports. Experts argued that the recoil forces would exceed the structural limits of any wooden airframe, but the recovery of shell fragments and the chilling testimony of multiple witnesses eventually forced an acceptance of this new, terrifying reality. Urgent requests were then made for longer-ranged anti-aircraft weapons that could engage the Mosquitoes before they reached their firing positions, but these programs would come too late. The attack on U-960 and other similar engagements in the Bay of Biscay sparked a desperate scramble within the German High Command. The Tsetse wasn't just sinking ships, it was exposing a critical vulnerability in their defensive philosophy. The war, they realized, had become a relentless battle of innovation, and they were falling behind. German intelligence redoubled its efforts to understand this new threat. Reports from neutral sources and captured Allied aircrews now took on a new urgency. They began to understand the concept of a flying six-pounder, but still struggled with the technical implications. Their engineers, highly skilled but often working in isolation, were tasked with finding countermeasures. One immediate, though ultimately ineffective response was the rushed development of new anti-aircraft systems. Experiments were made with guided missiles and proximity-fused shells designed to engage aircraft at extended ranges. Concepts like the Flakzielgerät 40, FZG-40, radar-controlled AA system, and missile programs like the Henschel H's 298 were accelerated. However, these programs were in their infancy and plagued by technical difficulties and production bottlenecks. They came far too late to affect the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. The technological gap, once small, was widening rapidly. More immediate, if equally desperate, measures were also attempted. There were experiments with mounting large-caliber Army 80 mm flak guns on specially reinforced vessels. While the 88 mm was a fearsome anti-aircraft weapon on land, its slow traverse rate and manual loading made it largely ineffective against fast-moving aircraft at sea. Its primary value was psychological, giving gun crews the feeling that they could at least attempt to engage attacking aircraft, even if the hit probability remained minimal at extended ranges. The sheer scale of German naval resources being diverted to these reactive, often futile efforts underscored the severity of the Tsetse threat. Another ingenious, though quickly identified countermeasure involved the use of decoy vessels. These were merchant ships equipped with numerous anti-aircraft weapons but minimal armor, intended to draw fire away from valuable submarines. British intelligence, however, quickly identified these flak traps and instructed their pilots to ignore them in favor of confirmed submarine targets. The Germans were constantly reacting, always a step behind, while the Allies continued to innovate. Beyond the statistics of sunken ships and technical specifications, the story of the Mosquito Tsetse is profoundly human. For the German sailors, the fear was palpable. Survivors described the psychological trauma of being under fire from weapons they could not effectively counter. The realization that an enemy aircraft could destroy their vessel from a distance where their own guns were silent, useless, bred a deep sense of vulnerability and helplessness. This mental toll was significant, leading to morale problems that persisted even after boats reached the relative safety of fortified ports. German submarine crews became increasingly reluctant to surface, even in heavily defended convoys, knowing that British aircraft possessed weapons that could penetrate their boats' pressure hulls from distances where return fire was ineffective. This fear contributed to the virtual abandonment of U-boat operations in the Bay of Biscay by late 1944. On the Allied side, the Tsetse pilots and ground crews were a breed apart. Squadron records from 248 Squadron indicate that Tsetse pilots required extensive training to master the unique flying characteristics of their modified aircraft. The off-center gun installation created asymmetric thrust, complicating engine-out procedures. The weapon's powerful recoil affected the aircraft's trim in ways that required constant adjustment during firing sequences. These were skills that took weeks, even months, to develop, even for experienced Mosquito pilots. They spent hours practicing against towed targets, developing the instinctive lead calculations and range estimation skills more commonly associated with naval surface combat than aerial warfare. The ground crews were equally specialized. At coastal command bases, specialized maintenance facilities were established where the complex Mullins gun mechanisms could be serviced. Technicians trained in both aircraft systems and artillery maintenance worked together, representing a unique fusion of technologies. Their expertise was crucial to keeping these complex, high-maintenance weapons operational. The operational doctrine for Tsetse employment also emphasized patience and precision over aggressive attack. Pilots were instructed to maintain optimal firing range, even if it meant prolonged exposure to enemy fire, trusting in their aircraft's speed and distance to provide protection rather than violent maneuvering. Statistical analysis of mission reports indicates that Tsetse aircraft achieved their highest success rates when operating in pairs, with one aircraft suppressing anti-aircraft positions while the other engaged primary targets. This tactical innovation maximized the limited 25-round ammunition capacity while minimizing exposure to return fire. It was a testament to meticulous planning and dedicated training. The Mosquito Tsetse, despite its relatively limited production run of approximately 27 aircraft, left an indelible mark on the history of aerial warfare. Production continued through 1944, but the program was eventually terminated in early 1945. This decision was influenced by the declining U-boat threat and the increasing need for aircraft capable of supporting ground operations. Rocket-equipped fighter bombers, while less accurate against hardened targets, offered greater versatility and could attack multiple target types without extensive modification. However, veterans of 248 Squadron maintained that no other weapon matched the Tsetse's ability to destroy hardened targets from safe distances. The strategic implications of the Tsetse's success influenced Allied planning for Pacific operations, with proposals to deploy similarly armed aircraft against Japanese shipping. While the surrender of Japan ended these plans before modified aircraft could be sent to the Far East, It underscored the recognition of the weapon's potent capabilities. Post-war analysis by the United States Navy's Operational Research Group concluded that the Mosquito Tsetse represented an optimal solution to a specific tactical problem, providing standoff engagement capability against hardened maritime targets without the complexity and expense of guided weapons. Though American forces chose to pursue rocket and torpedo solutions that offered greater flexibility despite lower accuracy, the Tsetse's impact was clear. The Tsetse demonstrated that conventional weapons could be adapted to meet emerging tactical challenges without requiring entirely new aircraft designs. This lesson influenced military procurement strategies for decades, emphasizing modification of existing platforms rather than the development of specialized, single-purpose aircraft. Contemporary military analysts still note its relevance to modern anti-ship warfare, where standoff engagement remains critical for aircraft survivability, even if modern solutions employ guided missiles rather than direct fire guns. The convergence of technologies represented by the Mosquito Tsetse, combining innovative aircraft design, robust artillery systems, and industrial automation derived from unexpected sources, exemplified the ingenuity that characterized Allied weapons development during the war. It was a potent example of how unlikely combinations of existing technologies could create capabilities that enemy forces could neither anticipate nor effectively counter. The story of the Mosquito Tsetse is more than just a tale of a powerful weapon. It's a testament to innovation under pressure, the relentless pursuit of tactical advantage, and the profound psychological impact of technological surprise. Its success wasn't measured solely in the number of ships it sank or damaged, but in the fundamental disruption it caused to German defensive doctrine. For Admiral Dönitz and the Kriegsmarine, the Tsetse forced a complete reconsideration of every aspect of submarine operations, from convoy formations to anti-aircraft armament. None of their existing or hastily developed countermeasures ultimately provided an effective defense against aircraft that could engage from beyond the range where German weapons could respond. It left submarine crews and their escorts vulnerable to precision strikes they could neither prevent nor properly counter. This brutal reality contributed significantly to the final collapse of the U-boat threat and the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Mosquito Tsetse was a brief but brilliant chapter in aerial warfare, a weapon born from desperation and forged by ingenuity. It proved that sometimes the most revolutionary solutions come from the most unexpected places, even from a cigarette machinery factory, and that in the relentless crucible of war, the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to strike from beyond the enemy's reach can be the ultimate decider. It taught a chilling lesson. When your enemy can hit you and you can't hit back, the game is truly over.